Hello and welcome to Frontrunner Motorsport. If you haven't already, you need to go and check out parts 1 and 2 of the ranking every Lotus Formula 1 driver ever from worst to best lists, because this is, of course, part 3. You know that because you clicked on it. Previously, we have looked at drivers who either never qualified or only had a handful of races into drivers who spent around half a season, maybe a full season, and scored some points. Now we are moving into the drivers who scored points, played a bigger part in Lotus's Formula 1 history, and eventually we will get to the race winners and Lotus champions. For now, we are going to be looking at the next 15 drivers on the list, numbers 30 to 16. Out of the 61 drivers who raced for Lotus in Formula 1, we are now moving into the more successful half of the list. So, after watching parts 1 and 2, and subscribing, let's jump into the video. Number 30, Walt Hansgen. The American sports car star was very late to the Grand Prix game. He was 41 when he took part in his first Formula 1 race with the Momo Corporation at the 1961 United States Grand Prix. He had already won 4 SCCA national championships in a Jaguar before his appearances in Formula 1, and he had to wait 3 years for a second go, which was with Lotus. He raced in a third Lotus Climax at the 1964 United States Grand Prix, and whilst Jim Clark and Mike Spence failed to finish the race, Walt Hansgen came home in 5th and scored 2 Formula 1 points, even though he was 3 laps down. He would go on to race in a couple of Indy 500s and the odd NASCAR race, but was killed whilst testing the Ford GT40 before the 24 Hours of Le Mans, made famous by that car beating the Ferraris for the first time. Had Hansgen been alive, he would have been a part of that. Number 29, Martin Donnelly. The sad career of Martin Donnelly. He was a star in the junior formulas, finishing 3rd in the British F3 Series, winning at Macau, and then finishing 3rd in the International F3000 Series in 1988. That International F3000 campaign was pretty incredible. Martin Donnelly raced for Eddie Jordan Racing but missed the first 5 races of the season, but in the last 5 he took 2 wins and 2 second places, enough to finish the year 3rd, despite not appearing in most of the season. He raced in the series again in 1989 and failed to finish in the first 5 races, but took a win at Brands Hatch and a podium at Birmingham. He got a one-off drive with Arrows, and made his Formula 1 debut at the 1989 French Grand Prix, finishing 12th. In 1990, he got his first full-time Formula 1 drive with Lotus, in the Lotus Lamborghini. The car was terrible, with the engine constantly braking, but Martin Donnelly put in some good performances, finishing 7th and just outside the points at the Hungarian Grand Prix. Sadly, his racing career came to an end a few races later, after being seriously injured in a mega crash at Jerez. After that, he stepped away from top-level motorsport, raced and owned teams at a much lower level, raced in the BTCC briefly in 2015, and has since become a team manager and driver coach. Number 28, John Miles. A true Lotus employee, John Miles was a long-time sports car driver and test driver for Lotus, and went on to work for the company's road car division. His racing career saw some success in British F3, but he really excelled racing in sports cars, winning several different championships, usually in Lotuses. He was given a chance to race for 4-wheel drive Lotus 63 in Formula 1 in 1969 because no one else wanted to, because it wasn't very good. John Miles replaced Graham Hill at the team in 1970, but retired from the majority of races because his car received a lot less attention than Jochen Rindt or Emerson Fittipaldi's. Miles scored 2 points for a 5th place at the South African Grand Prix, but left the team after Jochen Rindt's death at the Italian Grand Prix. He worked as a test driver for BRM and made a few motorsport appearances here and there, but round down his racing career. John Miles sadly passed away in 2018, but at the very least outlived the Lotus Formula 1 team, and even its later copycats. Number 27, Alessandro Zanardi. It's a shame most people remember Alex Zanardi for his unfortunate accident and not for being a class race driver. He first raced in Formula 1 for Jordan after finishing 2nd to Christian Fittipaldi in the 1991 International F3000 Series. He did a few races for Minardi in 1992 and then moved to Lotus for most of 1993 and most of 1994. He scored a point at the 1993 Brazilian Grand Prix, but his time at Lotus was hampered by a terrible car as they entered their death spiral. After scoring no points in 1994, he moved to America, won the kart series twice, returned to Formula 1 with Williams in 1991 in a not very successful season. Zanardi actually scored more points for Lotus than he did for Williams. He returned to kart in 2001 but was severely injured at the Lausitz-Ring, a crash that cost him his legs. He recovered and continued racing, taking wins in the World Touring Cars and winning gold in hand cycling in the Paralympics. Unfortunately, he has had a couple of unfortunate incidents that have affected his health, a bad cycling crash in 2020 and then a house fire in 2022. Hopefully the last few years have treated Zanardi a lot better. Number 26, John Surtees. You might think it's strange to see a Formula 1 world champion this far down the list. Well, Surtees won that championship with Ferrari, not Lotus. After dominating the world of motorcycle racing, John Surtees turned up in Formula 1, won a world championship for Ferrari, took wins in a Cooper and a Honda, and podiums for BRM, before starting his own Formula 1 team. In 1960 though, he made his Formula 1 debut for Lotus. He retired from his debut at Monaco with transmission issues, but finished second on his second start at that year's British Grand Prix. He made just 2 other appearances for Lotus, retiring from both. He moved to Reg Parnell for 1961 and 1962, before spending 3 and a bit years with Ferrari, before their famous falling out at the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans, then moving between Cooper, Honda and BRM, before founding Team Surtees. He raced for his own team until he retired from racing after 1972, and he moved away from competitive motorsport when Team Surtees came to an end in 1978. Number 25, Johnny Dumfries. John Colum Crichton Stewart, 7th Marquess of Boot, or Johnny Dumfries to his friends, had a single season of Formula 1 with Lotus in 1986. He was the 1984 British Formula 3 champion, dominating the series, but struggling to match those performances in the brand new International F3000 series. He replaced Elio De Angelis at Lotus and sat alongside Ayrton Senna, but he could not compete with his Brazilian teammate. He did score a few points, a 5th place at Hungary, and a 6th at Australia, but he was often in the midfield throughout the season. His biggest motorsport success was not in Formula 1, but winning the 24 Hours of Le Mans for Jaguar a couple of years later, alongside Jan Lammers and Andy Wallace. A few years later, he was done with motorsport and took up his lordly duties. He passed away in 2021 after a bout of cancer. Number 24, Derek Warwick. From the aristocracy to a working class hero, Warwick made his way to Formula 1 in a very unusual way, winning championships in Superstocks before moving to Formula 3. He won a British F3 Championship in 1978 and finished runner-up in the European Formula 2 Championship in 1980, behind Brian Henton, before moving to Formula 1. His first season with Toleman was not anything to write home about, failing to qualify for 11 of 12 races. He raced for the team again in 1982, but scored no points and only finished 2 races, before scoring points for Toleman at the end of the 1983 season. He moved to Renault for the next couple of years, taking 4 podiums and finishing 7th overall in 1984, but retiring from a lot of races. After a disappointing 1985, he moved to Brabham in 1986 and then Arrows in 1987, where he scored regular points for the team. Warwick finished 8th overall in 1988 and 10th in 1989 and got a seat at Lotus for 1990. It was a pretty miserable season, with a couple of points finishes in a sea of retirements. Warwick went off and won the Le Mans race and World Sports Car Championship with Peugeot in 1992 and had a final go at Formula 1 with Footwork in 1993, moved to touring cars, taking a win in the BTCC, and retiring from full-time racing in 1998. He still turns up in Formula 1 to this day as a race steward, and honestly, the man is one of my favourite race drivers of all time. Number 23, Jackie Oliver. Given the task of replacing the late great Jim Clark must have been daunting for Jackie Oliver. He had found success in sports car racing with a Lotus Elan and was called up to the works Lotus Formula 1 seat for the German Grand Prix of 1987. He qualified 16th but second of the Formula 2 cars in the field and managed to bring it home in 5th place, but he did not score points because he was in a Formula 2 car. He raced full-time for Lotus in 1968, replacing Jim Clark from the Monaco Grand Prix onwards. He scored points at Spa, but took a podium at the final round in Mexico. He was moved on to make space for Jochen Rindt in 1969, and Jackie Oliver never sat in a reliable Formula 1 car ever again. 2 disappointing seasons for BRM, a few drives for McLaren, and a rough season with Shadows. That did at least see Jackie Oliver take a second podium. He was also a Le Mans winner and a Can-Am champion. He would go on to be one of the founders of the Arrows Formula 1 team in the late 70s. Number 22, Cliff Allison. Alongside Graham Hill, Cliff Allison was the first Lotus Formula 1 driver. He was handpicked by Colin Chapman to race Lotus sports cars in a variety of events, such as the 1957 Le Mans race and alongside the boss at Sebring. He finished in the first 2 races of his Formula 1 career in 6th place at Monaco and Zandvoort, sadly before he got points for a 6th place finish. He scored points for a 4th place finish at Spa, but scored no points for the rest of the year. He did a handful of races for Ferrari, including a 2nd place at the 1960 Argentina Grand Prix. Unfortunately, he crashed a customer Lotus for the British Racing Partnership. That ended his racing career, and he went back to running for Family Garage, an anticlimactic end to what seemed to be an exciting career at one point. Number 21, Trevor Taylor. 1958 British Formula 3 champion Trevor Taylor even managed to share the 1960 Formula Junior Championship with Jim Clark in his self-entered Lotus 18. He got to make his Formula 1 debut at the 1961 Dutch Grand Prix with Lotus, having failed to qualify in his own Cooper in 1959. It was the only race he took part in that year, in Formula 1 at least. But he returned for Lotus in 1962 and finished second at the opening round, but failed to score for the rest of the year, despite leading at Spa. He was passed by Clark and had a massive accident with Willie Mares. He put in good performances in non-championship races, sharing a win with Clark in Mexico, and was confirmed for 1963. Unfortunately, in championship races, he couldn't match the earlier performances and had a best finish of 6th at Monaco. He left Lotus and raced for the British Racing Partnership in 1964, scoring a point but with not much success, and he left Formula 1 altogether after a failed attempt with Shannon in 1966. He'd spent a few years racing in Formula 5000, but retired from racing by the 70s. Number 20, Peter Arundel. Found success in Formula Junior in an Elva and a Lotus, but it was the latter he raced for in Formula 1. Actually, Peter Arundel raced exclusively for Lotus in the run-up to his Formula 1 appearances. His first start was at Monaco in 1964, and Arundel managed to get on the podium. He then repeated that feat at Zandvoort one race later, and everything was looking good. He retired at Spa but scored more points in France, but then a crash in a Formula 2 race kept him out of racing until midway through 1966. He couldn't hit the highs of earlier in his career and left Lotus with just another point scored, retiring from racing in 1969. In non-championship races, he got 6 podiums from 8 starts, so definitely had the talent for Formula 1. That Formula 2 crash at Reims stopped his career and he never recovered from mojo. He was also third in the British touring cars in 1966. Number 19, Satoru Nakajima. The Nakajima name is a tour de force in Japan, but neither Satoru or his son Kazuki were able to make a big impact in Formula 1. Satoru Nakajima won 5 Japanese Formula 2 championships between 1981 and 1986, and he was a midfield runner in the International F3000 series with Team Walt in 1986. Lotus signed a deal with Honda for engines in 1987, and Satoru Nakajima was part of the deal. He spent 3 years with Lotus, but often struggled to match his more illustrious teammates in Ayrton Senna and Nelson Piquet. He scored 7 points in 1987, 1 in 1988, and despite not having Honda engines, Lotus stuck with Nakajima for 1989, where even though he didn't score many points, he earned praise with a great drive to 4th at the Australian Grand Prix. He joined Tyrrell for an uneventful 2 years, and worked with Honda as they readied a Works F1 entry that never appeared. He retired from racing but since started the Nakajima Racing Team, which has been very successful in Super Formula to this day, and he has even seen his son race for Williams in Formula 1. Number 18, Ryan Rissell. Lotus has a strong history with Swedish drivers, the first of which we'll be talking about is Ryan Rissell. The 1967 Swedish Formula 3 champion made his way to Formula 1 with Lotus in 1970, replacing John Miles, who left after Jochen Rindt's death at Monza. Rissell did the final 2 races of the year, taking a podium in America on his debut. He was retained for 1971 and scored for the odd points finish through the year, but was dropped by Lotus for 1972. He raced for BRM in 1972 but only finished a single race, and even did 2 starts back with Lotus, before seeing out his career with drives in a customer March and the Works March team at the 1974 Swedish Grand Prix, which turned out to be Ryan Rissell's final Formula 1 race. He carried on in sports cars and touring cars until around 1980. Number 17, Johnny Herbert. The recently sacked FIA race steward was British Formula 3 champion in 1987 and was doing well in International F3000. Having taken a win and being in with a chance at the championship when a big crash at Brands Hatch took him out for the rest of the year. His return a year later with Benetton and Tyrrell in Formula 1 is nothing short of miraculous. He struggled to nail down a full-time drive for a few years and raced every now and again for Lotus starting in 1990. It took until 1992 to score his first points for Lotus, who was sliding towards oblivion at this point. Herbert scored a couple of points in 1992 and even had a good 1993, scoring 11 points and finishing the year within the top 10 of the championship. As Lotus entered their final year, Herbert was still with the team, but left with 3 races of the season to go. He left for Ligier and then Benetton, who he raced for in 1995, taking 2 wins. He would then go on to race for Sauber, taking 2 podiums, Stuart Ford in 1999, taking a win, and finally Jaguar in 2000, scoring nothing. He'd continue racing in sports cars, finishing second at Le Mans 3 years in a row with Audi, and even raced in the BTCC. In more recent years, he's been a race steward and TV personality. Number 16, Mike Spence. Our final driver for this video is Mike Spence. He raced in sports car racing and moved to Formula Junior in 1961. He finished second in a non-championship Formula 1 race at Brands Hatch in an Emerson and moved to Lotus in Formula Junior for 1963. He debuted in Formula 1 at the Italian Grand Prix and performed admirably in a hobbled car. After Peter Arundel was injured midway through the 1964 season, Mike Spence was called up to replace him and scored a few points, getting a full-time drive for 1965. This was his final season with Lotus, and he only scored points at a few races, but he ended on a high with a podium at Mexico and an 8th place in the championship. He raced a custom Lotus in 1966 for Reg Parnell and moved to BRM in 1967. He returned to the Lotus fold for the Indy 500 in 1968, but was killed in a crash in practice. He never achieved a lot in Formula 1, but he did take a couple of non-championship wins and was a quality Lotus driver. So that is part 3 of the ranking every Lotus Formula 1 driver ever list. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think anyone here should be higher or lower on the list? Do you want to make any guesses at the order of the drivers in the final video? Speaking of which, you will need to subscribe to the channel to make sure you do not miss the final parts of this series, with the final 15 Lotus drivers placed in order. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.